Shalom. So in a previous job, I used to do a lot of speaking to Christian audiences, in particular about Jews and Judaism. And one of the things I always said to them was, if you hear a speaker and they begin their talk with the following sentence, don't pay any attention to the rest of what they said. Okay? The Jewish position on X is Y. Okay? I think I don't know, maybe idolatry, right? Idolatry is bad. That's the Jewish position. Okay, how to define idolatry? I spoke about that last week. How to define idolatry is complicated. Okay, but idolatry is bad. That's the Jewish position. But beyond that, and because the tradition is so diverse, okay, and there was actually, I have to say, the Washington Jewish Week did a good job. They had an article. They interviewed local rabbis about the Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life shooter being sentenced to death. And some rabbis were in favor and some rabbis were opposed. But the people who were in favor said, you know, you could argue the opposite. And the people who were opposed said you could argue the opposite. And I agree with that, right? I mean, I mentioned one of my teachers in rabbinical school, Rabbi Ben Hollander, who once said, I have an opinion, but I don't agree with it. And that is absolutely the way, I mean, I could construct an argument either way. And having constructed the argument, I would disagree with it, okay? But, you know, so it's not so easy to say the Jewish position, right? I mean, you know, you could say the position that is held by the majority of Jews, right? But that doesn't make it a Jewish position, right? I mean, I think if you took a survey of Jews in Maryland, we would have to conclude that the Jewish position is that crabs are kosher, right? I got news for you. They're not, okay? If you want to eat them, I'm not going to stop you, but they ain't kosher, okay? And that's not subject to a majority vote. Anyway, that was not the beginning of my talk. This is, okay? A quote by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Judaism is more interested in society than state, in relationships more than governmental structures. It sees society as the arena in which specific ideals are realized. Justice, compassion, the rule of law combined with respect for the sanctity of life and the dignity of the individual. The Torah is a unique attempt to create a nation governed not by the pursuit of power or the accumulation of wealth, but by recognition of the worth of each person as the image of God. Needless to say, this is an almost impossibly high ideal, and much of the Hebrew Bible, especially the prophetic books, is devoted to telling the story of how Israel fell short time and again. But it never lost the aspiration or the dream. Okay, so I think what Rabbi Sachs means is that there are certain goals, right, that the Torah sets out for us. And it's important that these goals be met, but the Torah doesn't necessarily tell us how to meet them. Okay, so for example, the Torah wants a society where the poor have their needs met. okay? It doesn't tell us how to meet those needs, right? And there, I think, I mean, to take an example, I mean, the current example here in Montgomery County, right? Who here is in favor of the idea that everybody should be able to afford a decent place to live? Who's in favor of it? How do we achieve that? Okay? How do we achieve that? A rent cap? I don't know. I mean, I could argue very convincingly that a rent cap is counterproductive because people won't do rental apartments, right? I mean, we're all in favor of affordable housing in somebody else's neighborhood, right? I mean, so, but everybody's in favor. It's just, but you know, without being sarcastic, it's a hard task for me, but I'll try, right? We can legitimately disagree about how to achieve that goal, right? Even while we agree that that goal itself is desirable, right? So the Torah tells us to meet those needs. It doesn't necessarily tell us how, okay? So while partisan politics per se do not belong in shul, right? I mean, I should never stand up here and tell you who to vote, right? And the board should never endorse a particular candidate, right? But we can talk about issues and we can talk about policies. And in that sense, this week's Parsha is very political. It's very political. It talks about establishing a judicial system, right? And that the judges should not take bribes, okay? And should not even be an appearance that they're taking a bribe, okay? Which is an ideal that we're not living in this country, right? It talks about establishing cities of refuge so that somebody who commits accidental manslaughter can be prevented from revenge. It talks about the death penalty only being applied where there's at least two witnesses. Talks about conscription. It talks about the limits of a sage in warfare and the appointment of a king, right? And unlike classic European law from many centuries ago, the king is not above the law, right? And as I mentioned in the introduction, that's why the king has to write a copy of the Torah and keep it with him at all times. Right now, so the Torah gives us quite a bit of guidance, right? But we don't paskin from the Torah, right? We don't make halachic rules from the text of the Torah, right? There's hundreds of years of interpretation, right? But the problem that we find ourselves in is that the halakha has not developed much in the area of guiding a society, right? Because it assumes a binary situation, right? Either a Jewish polity, which must be guided by halakha, or a Gentile polity in which Jews can hope at best not to be persecuted too much, right? I mean, the Tsar never told his poster, go out and find out what the Jews are thinking, and then I'll decide what I'm going to do, right? The Tsar didn't care what the Jews were thinking, right? And the Kaiser didn't care, and the Pasha didn't care. Nobody cared what the Jews were thinking, right? It was a Goyish polity, and, you know, who was a good ruler? One who didn't persecute the Jews too much, right? But that's not the society in which we live, right? It's simply not. You can't say that this is a Gentile society where Jews are just subjects, right? I mean, look at how many Jews are in the cabinet. Look at how many Jews are in the Senate. Look at how many Jews are in that. Look at how many Jews are on the county council, right? And, so a Jewish presidential chief of staff steps down, right? So Plain is replaced by Zionists, right? I mean, we have power in this country, and therefore you can't simply say, well, that's external to me, right? The Gentiles are going to do what they're going to do, and that's external to me, right? But on the other hand, right, go up to Congress and say, the Torah says blah, 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 therefore Congress should pass this law, right? I mean, when evangelicals do it, we hit the roof, right? We absolutely hit the roof when evangelicals try to legislate their particular beliefs into law. We shouldn't do it either, right? So that what is the role of a Jewish citizen in a democratic, pluralistic society? What does Halakha say about that? The answer is not much, okay? Conversely, what is the role of a non-Jew in a democratic Jewish polity? The Halakha also doesn't have a lot to say about that, okay? And if you look at the struggle over that has to do actually with what is the role of the 20% of Israeli citizens who are not Jewish, right? And especially what is the role of the 40, 50, 60% of Israeli Jewish citizens who are not observant, right? And these are complicated issues, and the halakha is still developing, right? The problem that we have in this country is that you have, a big chunk of Jews who take their Americanism seriously and don't take their Judaism seriously. And we have a smaller chunk of Jews, right, like in the neighborhood in Brooklyn where I grew up, right, who take their Judaism very seriously, but don't take their Americanism very seriously, except what can I get from the government? What can I get from the government, right? But the subset of Jews who take their Americanism seriously and their Judaism seriously is very small, right? It's essentially serious conservative and modern Orthodox Jews, right? And we have not been doing this long enough to develop a theology of citizenship, right? And even in Israel, right? A lot of people in Israel take their Judaism seriously. We don't need a constitution, right? Why doesn't Israel have a constitution? It doesn't have a constitution because the Orthodox say we don't need a constitution. We already have one. It's called the Torah, right? But the Torah doesn't. The principles of the Torah answer, I think, right, the necessities of a modern state. The specifics of the Torah do not. But even in the Torah, right, we have guidance. I mean, the Torah is very, very clear on the separation of powers, right? And that is why, in my opinion, you can disagree, the judicial reform is contrary to Jewish norms because it eliminates the separation of powers, right? The king and the judges are independent, right? And the minute that the king can overrule the judges, that's not the system that the Torah anticipates, right? And I don't care how many beards and black hats are pushing this idea, it's contrary to the Torah, right? Quote again from Rabbi Sachs to wind up. Perhaps Judaism's deepest political truth is that people do not exist to serve the state. The state exists to serve the people whose true service is not to man, but to God. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with the Kaddish before Musaf and the Musaf service, page 155 or 428, and then we'll say